think that worked now. Sorry for the technical issues. Let's dive right into the movies. As I mentioned, these are all mostly first-time watches for me. I had only seen one of them before I watched this batch. But let's start with the big three icons of silent comedy, which is the order I watched them in also. We're going to talk about Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin. One moment. The three big icons of silent comedy, and that is Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and Harold Lloyd. The first film I watched for this theme was Buster Keaton's Seven Chances. Now, I had seen a version of this film before in 1999's The Bachelor, starring Chris O'Donnell and Renee Zellweger, and I didn't really like that movie very much. So I was a little bit nervous going into this one, but I realized that was silly because I've never not loved a Buster Keaton movie. And this one was absolutely no exception. I loved this film. The thing that really sets Keaton apart from his contemporaries, including Chaplin and Lloyd, is his physicality. Now, don't get me wrong. Those guys are great physical comedians. These three guys were all capable of amazing physical comedy. But the running, jumping, swinging, everything that Tom Cruise wishes he could be, Buster Keaton was. And I don't want to spend too long on these movies. I just kind of want to talk about them a little bit, but because I could go on for a long time about this movie, but I'm just going to say that while Seven Chances wasn't my favorite Buster Keaton movie, in fact, it's probably not in my top five, I have no choice but to consider it a masterpiece, basically with everything else I've seen from him. He may have a stinker in there somewhere, but if that's the case, I've never seen it, and I highly doubt it, but it's possible. But yeah, so I did enjoy this movie quite a lot. It does feature probably my favorite transition scene, or one of my favorite transition scenes I've ever seen in a movie, not just a silent film, but like any film. It's the one where he gets in the car and then it transitions to the place where the car is going to be without the car moving. It's very, very good, and I enjoyed it the couple times they did it in this movie. But moving on, I want to talk about another seminal figure in comedy and film at large, and that's Charles Chaplin. This was my one rewatch. I've seen this one a couple times, but I was so delighted to get to revisit it for this. The movie is Gold Rush. This film actually features one of my first forays into silent film. Into silent comedy, rather. I'd seen a little bit here and there as far as like silent film and clips and pieces. It was the 80s and 90s, so it was usually you'd see it in a clip in something rather than, because we didn't have like the internet or YouTube back then. But when I was a kid, I was kind of obsessed with this movie called Benny and June. In that film, Johnny Depp plays an eccentric man who is obsessed with the works of Keaton, Chaplin, and Lloyd. The three that we're talking about right now. And throughout the film, he recreates a number of comedic bits from those guys. One in particular is directly from the film Gold Rush. In the films, the Tramp and Sam, respectively, put a fork in like a bread roll and then make it dance. And I loved that when I saw it in Benny and June. Years later, when I finally got into silent comedy, because of how much I loved that movie and that character particularly, I was giddy as a schoolboy when I finally saw this scene. It was a comedy bit that will stay with me forever. Both versions of it, but particularly the Chaplin version, is just really incredible and one that I absolutely adore. Every time I revisit this movie, I absolutely adore that little bit, that scene. The thing that I think sets Chaplin apart from the other two is his ability to seamlessly blend comedy and drama. As many times you find yourself laughing at something, you can also find a gut-wrenching heartbreak. In the Gold Rush, there's the scene that I just raved about a few moments ago, is followed by a absolutely crushing moment of realization that will shatter a person, as it shattered me, and I'm sure many of you if you've seen this movie. Like Seven Chances for Keaton, this was also not my favorite Chaplin movie. I mean, there are a few that I like a little bit more than this, but this one was much, much closer. It's for sure a masterpiece. It's, I think, certainly in my top 5 Chaplin movies. I mean, it's not important where it ranks. It's just that it's a masterpiece. But I definitely really love this movie, and I love getting to revisit it. This leads me to the last of the silent comedy trifecta, Harold Lloyd. It's fitting that he's last simply because he is the one that is not talked about nearly as much as the other two, which is a real shame because he may have the best comedic timing of all 3 of them. He's not flashy like Keaton and not as well-rounded as Chaplin, but he has an eye for comedy that is unmatched. Harold Lloyd always knew exactly where the joke was, and he knew how to execute it and to get to the next joke from that joke. All of that is very, very present in The Freshman. There is almost no frame of this movie where Lloyd isn't in some state of being hilarious. He's just very, very funny. The physical comedy, the faces he makes, the way that he just goes all in for each of the comments. And as I mentioned, like, his jokes are always setting up the next joke, and then his jokes are recurring throughout the thing. It's a very, very funny thing to watch, and his timing is really, really incredible. It's amazing how film can transcend decades and generational lines to say something timeless. Although 100 years separates me from The Freshman, the themes within it are so familiar to me. The events of the movie never actually happened to me, but the feeling of being an outsider, the feeling of wanting to belong, the feeling of isolation, those are all feelings I relate to very well and on a very real level. And I think a lot of other people probably do too. Well, I do believe that Harold Lloyd deserves to be spoken in the same breath as the other 2 that we've talked about here. This one didn't quite hit the heights of their movies in this case. There are other Lloyd movies that I like a lot more than this one, and that do set up there with those 2, and that's just unfortunately wasn't one of them. Not that I didn't find it entertaining. I found it very entertaining and very relatable, and I do gave it extremely high marks. I think it's an incredible film that I really, really loved watching. It just, in comparison to the other 2, is just a small step below, but it's a small step. It's not huge at all. So I just wanted to make that clear, because it is not about Harold Lloyd being lesser. It's just that film didn't hit me as well as some other Harold Lloyd films hit me. The next film that I watched was Battleship Potemkin, which is the first one that everyone recommended when I said I was doing films from 1925. But come on, guys, of course, it was on my list. This film has been on Sight and Sound's greatest films of all time, basically since the inception of that list. And most of the time it was in the top 10. It wasn't until recently that it dropped lower than that upper tier area. And that's just because there's a lot of great films that have come out in the years since 1952, I believe, is when that list started. And I absolutely see why it's on that list and why it spent so much time in the top 10, because this movie is a masterpiece of a war film. I know I've used that word a lot here today, but when you're dealing with this group of films, it's hard not to use that word. This film so eloquently illustrates the horrors of war, fascism, and the need for revolution. One scene in particular is often mentioned when people talk about this movie, and you may know what it is, but it's a scene that I had never seen, but I have seen the influence it's had over the last 100 years of film. And that scene is the Odessa Steppe sequence. If you've never seen this movie, you've almost certainly seen an homage or even a parody of this scene. Probably in films like The Untouchables, Brazil, even Denis Villeneuve's Dune, and of course, Naked Gun 33 and a third, The Final Insult, which is technically parrying the stairs scene from The Untouchables, but that was inspired by this, so I'm counting it. It's technically inspired by this scene. As incredible as some of those homages are, I can say nothing compares to the original. Having now seen it, it's one of the greatest sequences ever put on film. And if you've never seen this film, I highly recommend you check it out, because in 1925, and anything before a talkie, it was very difficult for to say anything in a film, because of course every piece of dialogue or exposition or anything like that had to be delivered through the intertitle cards, the black pictures with the white words on it. So they had to show instead of tell, which is something that they still tell you to do today, but they had no choice back then. They didn't really have the ability to tell, in at least in any major way. This film, even though I'm separated by the culture, and I'm separated by 100 years of actual time, at no point did I feel like I was watching something, I want to say foreign, but I don't mean like foreign as in from another country. I mean something that I didn't understand. I never felt like I couldn't understand why these people were going through this or what was happening with them. It perfectly illustrated that need for revolution, which I love a revolution. But I really look forward to revisiting this film to see if I love it as much on rewatch as I did this time. Chances are I will, because of how it has endured, and also it is worth noting that it is the all-time favorite film of my all-time favorite director, Billy Wilder. The last film I want to talk about is one that I've seen iterations of many times, and that is The Phantom of the Opera. This one has me a little bit divided. I enjoyed my time with it, but I also think because I've seen so many different versions of it, the story, because I've seen so many different versions of this story, the film as a whole didn't quite work for me as well, which is unfortunate. But that's just kind of how it went. It kind of feels unfair because this is one of the first, if not the first adaptation of the story. I didn't look into that. I should have before I recorded this. But there's a lot that really impressed me about this film, even though I didn't necessarily connect to the film as a whole so much. There's a lot that really impressed me. The set pieces are so gorgeous and so striking, especially considering the time that it was made in terms of the scope of what they had to deal with. Just some of this is like really impressive. There's that chandelier in the middle of the theater. It's just huge, and there's people walking around looking at it, and it's just. And there's dungeons, and there's just like a bunch of this was just very, very impressive in terms of the production design and the set pieces and all of that. But just that was the shining light in this movie for me, because and Lon Chaney and his best Lon Chaney doing with the makeup, and it was very much an iconic performance with him when he didn't wear the mask, which brings me to the one thing that really bugged me about this movie. And again, this is probably unfair, but it was his mask. There have been so many iconic versions of this mask and of what the Phantom looks like with the mask on, that I didn't really expect to see one so bland and uninteresting. There's a reason the most iconic shots from this movie are ones with him without the mask. You don't really see him with the mask if you're not watching the movie. Like if you're seeing iconic shots from this movie, it's definitely him without the mask because he's so expressive and he looks so cool, and it's Lon Chaney doing makeup work. Like that's where the iconography for this film comes from. But even the posters for this movie, I looked at several. Even the posters know that this is a bad mask. I mean, you don't even really ever see the mask, which is something you'd never really get today, because today, most of the time, this would be sold on the iconography of the character in the mask. whereas this one was more sold on what he looked like under the mask, because a lot of posters have him without the mask, and the ones that have him with the mask, like the one that I just showed you a moment ago, I'll bring it back up, have a mask that is not his. He never wears that hat. He never wears that mask. None of that is what he looks like, and that's just because the one that he does wear in the thing is just so bland and uninteresting. And it would have been much better if they had put a little bit more thought into that, which they put. I assume they just put all the thought into the makeup, but it would have been very, very cool if the mask looked a lot better. I don't know that it would have made me like love this movie, but that is one thing the whole time I'm thinking, gosh, he's nothing to look at right now. And that's just kind of how I felt in that. Overall, I did enjoy this movie, but after the other four, this was just a little bit underwhelming. And that's the only thing. That's the best way to put it. It's underwhelming, but that's just because I'd watched four really great movies that I absolutely loved. But that's 1925. Next week we are continuing our little 25 theme and watching movies made by directors 25 years of age or younger. I've had a couple people ask me, does that mean 25 now or 25 when they made the movie? It's any movie made by someone who was 25 or younger when they made the movie is going to be the theme. So let me know if you've seen any of the 1925 movies I talked about and what you think about them. Are there any 1925 movies I didn't talk about that you absolutely love? Do you have any recommendations for movies by directors who are 25 or younger? Talk to me in the comments. Bye.